So, thank you very much for having me here tonight. It's great to be back in Texas and in Houston in particular, where I have some political history, as I'll tell you in a minute. But I wanted to take a few minutes just to talk about what we need to do in 2020. And I'm not talking about who's going to do it. I'm talking about what we all as a party need to do. I think the number one thing that we need to do by and in 2020 is we need to elect a Libertarian President of the United States. This is actually entirely feasible. Most of you know people all over the country are utterly fed up with the rigid monopoly practiced by the R Party and the D Party in Washington, D.C., and the resulting gridlock. That's the stuff of every day's newspapers. And Americans aren't stupid. They understand that both the R Party and the D Party have stopped working for we the people in Washington. They really have. And they're obsessed with re-election, so they're working only for the special moneyed interests who will bankroll their campaigns and thus return them to office, which is all they care about. Both these parties are nanny state parties. Both of them are the opposite of the Libertarian Party. Once upon a time, in Houston, Texas, at a Republican National Convention, I declared from the podium, I was a newly elected governor, I said, and I quote, "I want the government out of your pocketbook and out of your bedroom." Houston, 1992. Well, the Democratic Party is happy to be in your pocketbook and taxing you to death, and the Republican Party is only too happy to be in your bedroom and lecturing you about your personal conduct and your personal choices. There's only one way to go, and that's the Libertarian Party, right up the middle. So that's the first thing we need to do. The second thing is money. I remind you that in 2016, Gary Johnson was at 13% in the national polls about 10 days before the so-called Commission on Presidential Debates was going to make their decision about who was going to be in those debates. That was too much for the D's and the R's. They poured millions and millions of dollars on us in negative advertising. So within a week or 10 days, we were driven down to 5% and didn't make it into the debates, which, as Gary said, was outcome determinative. So this time, meaning 2020, we're going to need to have, as a party, $50 million or $100 million in our war chest at the beginning of the campaign, not the $15 million that Gary Johnson and I had for the entire cycle. To complement this effort to make an end run around the D Party and the R Party, actually, as was said earlier, it's really a run up the middle. It's not an end run. We need to have election reforms. We need to start by abolishing the Commission on Presidential Debates. By their own admission, the two chairs, they are a lackey of the R Party, the D Party, and they brought us nothing but gridlock and stagnation. Everybody knows it. Number two, we should lower the threshold for participation in those debates from 15% to 10% or 5%. That's a consensus position at this point. Number three, and I personally filed a lawsuit in Massachusetts to compel this a few weeks ago, we should reform the Electoral College to require that it respect the constitutional requirement of one person, one vote, also called equal protection under the 14th Amendment. And I filed a suit to compel this on the ground that voters in Massachusetts, my state, unless they're Democrats, they're not represented when the Electoral College gets together, because we could get 35% of the vote. We get no electoral votes. That violates one person, one vote. And there's a Hugo Black Supreme Court decision right on point saying that that's unconstitutional. And if the relief that we seek had been in place in 2016, because Gary and I got a little bit of votes in a lot of states and no electoral votes, but if our system had been enforced, Gary Johnson, even though we didn't get, the 15, 20% of the vote, Gary Johnson would have had 17 electoral votes if that system had been in place. So it has real consequences. We have to turn over the decennial redistricting to nonpartisan, non-political commissions, citizen commissions, maybe even under court supervision. We can't have this hyper gerrymandering, which means that the only way you can lose your seat in Congress is the Republican can only lose to a challenger from the right and the Dems challenger from the left, which makes them hyper partisan, which makes nothing happen. And my personal favorite electoral reform is term limits. I was national co-chair of U.S. term limits when I was in office. 2 terms for the Senate, 3 for the House, should be plenty. You'll never get Congress to go along with it, but many people, led by Gary Johnson, know that under Article 5 of the Constitution, you can amend it without going through Congress if you go through the states, and that's the only way we're going to get term limits in, and we should try and do that. We, of course, need a substantive platform to go with these reforms to oust the bad guys. I'd start with spending, first of all, and require the federal government to live within its means, just like households. No more deficits, not no $100 trillion deficits, no more deficits. Every state except Vermont, coincidentally the home of Bernie Sanders, every state except Vermont is required by its constitution to balance its budget. Now, why shouldn't the federal government be required to do so as well? This is not hard stuff. When I was in office, I was voted the most fiscally conservative governor in the United States by both the Wall Street Journal and the Cato Institute. And this is in a state that until I got there, succeeding Michael Dukakis, the name of the state was Taxachusetts. No more. The other thing I would be very keen about in the substantive platform is privatization, ending the automatic government monopoly on services that are now delivered by the feds, put them out to bid by companies in the private sector. And I think you'll find, if that's done at the federal level, as we certainly did in Massachusetts, they can be delivered at lower cost and with greater dignity for recipients in the private sector. Again, my other top priority when I was governor, I was national co-chair of the U.S. Privatization Council. This also complies with the spirit of the 10th Amendment about, powers not delegated to the feds being reserved to the states or the people, which is always a good thing. You need to talk about taxation. I cut taxes 21 times in my 2 terms, never raised them once. I literally abolished the long-term capital gains tax to stimulate capital formation, and our unemployment rate as a result of that in Massachusetts went from the highest of the 11 industrialized states to the lowest. Just 2 more. Number 4, guns. We've got 300 million rifles out there in this country in private hands. And need I add, lawfully in private hands. And it's time for all sides to agree, and I think this, again, is becoming a consensus position. They're not going anywhere, and no restrictions may be imposed on further purchase of such weapons by private citizens, including, of course, very much the much maligned military weapon that has served the American military so well, the AR-15. Late in the campaign in 2016, I insisted on going to South Dakota, and I went to the town of Deadwood, which had the best sort of t-shirt store I've ever seen in my life. And I bought this big sweatshirt with a picture of Geronimo, the Indian leader, on it. This is about guns. He's holding a rifle over his head. He's grinning at the camera as though he's trying to sell you something. At the top of the sweatshirt, it says, "Turn in your weapons." Geronimo grinning at the camera, holding his rifle over his head. Down at the bottom it says, "The government will protect you." Didn't work out so good for Geronimo. In fact, there are many examples through history of countries who have been persuaded to turn in their weapons to the government. Some of this goes back to the Middle Ages and earlier, and rapidly become enslaved. And that should be part of the national discussion about guns. Finally, cannabis. As Gary Johnson so eloquently explained, we have to deschedule marijuana as a Class 1 narcotic in Washington. Class 1 is supposed to be for substances with no medical utility whatsoever. That's demonstrably just not true about cannabis and marijuana and the active ingredients, including the CBD. So within the last week, the Trump administration has said they want to have comments on descheduling marijuana as a Class 1. That's very good. Today, President Trump said, I'm going to knuckle under to Cory Gardner of Colorado, and we're not going to mess with states that have legalized cannabis. Also within the last week, I went on the board of a cannabis company called Acreage Holdings with, if you can believe it, and I have a long history, not as a consumer of marijuana, but back in the 90s, I came out for medical marijuana for glaucoma and nausea from chemotherapy, 1992, 93, 15 years before anybody else. So I'm with the program. But I joined the board with another guy who's never been with the program. His name is John A. Boehner. He was the Speaker of the House, and now he's agreed to join me in crusading for delisting marijuana as a Class 1 narcotic. John is on that issue partly for veterans. He's a veteran crusader for veterans causes. 20% of all veterans, and there are 20 million in the country, 20% use marijuana daily. That's illegal. They're subject to being listed as drug abusers in their official file at the VA. How's that for town gown relations, or relationship between the VA and the veterans? It's absolutely pathetic. And the VA doctors and nurses know that they need it for PTSD, for depression, for anxiety. There are 22 veterans who commit suicide every day in this country. That's 1 an hour. And we're telling them, we think so little of your service that we're not going to let you alleviate them yourself, even though 20% of you are doing it now, self-medicating it. I'm in it, and I'll close with this, but I'm in it mainly because I think it's ridiculous not to be able to conduct study and research on the effect that marijuana can have in alleviating diseases. And I'm not talking only about anxiety and insomnia and sort of not official diseases like that. In Israel's the only country in the world where research on marijuana is legal, and there's a guy called Raphael Meshulam at Hebrew University who has unearthed a bunch of evidence that the ingredients of marijuana, led by CBD, can help to alleviate cancer. Cancer, for pity's sake. How much do we spend in this country every year trying to find a cause to deal with cancer? Epilepsy, particularly among children, already proven. Try this on. How about taking kids from 60 seizures a day down to 1 a month? Okay? I have a niece who has that phenomenon, and she's not been able to get it addressed, and this is one of the reasons. Hepatitis, this is again the Israel research, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and schizophrenia. This federal law, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know how many of you remember the 1930s movie, or whoever's seen it, called Reefer Madness. It first demonized marijuana, and it's never left the consciousness of generations above mine. Anyway, this current federal policy is truly reefer madness. Thank you.